Hello and welcome to the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, president of the White House Historical Association. Today we welcome Gary Walters, the longest-serving White House chief usher. He's written a new book published by the White House Historical Association called White House Memories, and you'll see right there underneath the title the years of 1970 to 2007. That's right, for 37 years and throughout 7 presidencies, Gary has worked at the White House. The chief usher and every person who works on the president's staff has a job that transcends politics. The chief usher not only oversees the day-to-day operations of the executive mansion, but serves the first family, whomever that may be. As Gary says, the White House is first and foremost a home. Gary started his tenure at the White House in 1970 during the Nixon presidency. He was an executive protective service officer, a precursor to what we now call the Uniform Division of the United States Secret Service. He then joined the usher's office in 1976 during the Ford presidency as an assistant usher. He was named chief usher by President Ronald Reagan in January of 1986. For the next 21 years, Gary served as chief usher for 4 presidents, first ladies, and their families. He managed the White House, which uniquely serves not only as a private home, but as an event venue and a living museum. In this new book, Gary recounts the joys of elegant state dinners and family moments and reflects on solemn moments such as the resignation of President Nixon and the events of September 11th, 2001. Gary's had an extraordinary life, one of faithful service to the presidency, the White House, and to the American people. And his generosity continues. Gary is accepting no royalty at all for the proceeds from this book that are being directed to the mission of the White House Historical Association to share the history of the White House, the People's House. So it's my pleasure to welcome our friend, Gary Walters, to the program today. So Gary, it's wonderful to have you with us here today, and you yourself are part of White House history.
Thank you.
Well, you worked in the White House from the Nixon presidency to the presidency of George W. Bush, quite a span of American history, and the things that you would have seen from your vantage point are really remarkable. And having read this book, it's a compelling story of those presidents, their families, those times and those events. But you, for a long time, were not going to share your story. What caused you to come forward? And I'm so grateful that you did. What brought you to this point?
Well, one of the things that I thought for quite a bit of time after I retired was that I had a lot of information personally about the families. And I was quite concerned if I tried to do something like that, that the desire would be for the publications to want to get into the personal life of the family. And I had that information. And I wasn't willing to do that. Privacy of the first family comes first. I stewed about it, and then somebody named Stuart came along and invited me almost 2 years ago now to a dinner to introduce the People's House. At that dinner, talking with people there, colleagues, yourself, kind of flipped the switch and said I could add, I thought, to the historical context of the family's life at the White House and possibly shift a little bit of the feelings about what the White House is instead of a political entity to a family's home and give a little bit behind the scenes of family life at the White House and introduce, I think, what really goes on behind the scenes and the intensity of what occurs from day to day.
Well, it's an unusual term that we don't hear often, chief usher. What is a chief usher, and where did that name come from?
Well, it was actually a term that derived from, I guess, the English, where the head of the household, that kind of morphed into what was the early stewards in the executive residence who assisted the president. And then the chief usher term devolved. Mrs. Kennedy didn't like it, and she tried to change it and thought about it and couldn't come up with anything better. So it stayed as a chief usher, and up until, I guess, just a few years ago, it remained just the chief usher. Now it's chief usher and executive officer in charge of the White House residence or something to that ghost of a name. I don't know. It's a little too long, but it's governmentese, I guess.
Right.
Chief usher served at the pleasure of the president. Head of the household is a good term, and that worked for the American people instead of something from the British.
Right. We think of Downton Abbey, really, when you say head of household.
Correct.
So from what function to what function? What is the range of responsibility that falls in your portfolio?
Well, the chief usher really has three primary functions. Number one is to serve the first family, protect their privacy, their home. Number two, it's for ceremonial events of the presidency that are held at the White House and on its grounds. And number three was as a museum for the American people. I mean, it is our history.
And in that portfolio of responsibility, there are the chefs, butlers, electricians, plumbers, florists, an array of people that you have to make sure are keep that home going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and adjust to things on the fly. What is that like? Is it like a professional team? Is it like a family?
You hit the right term, a family. The executive residence staff was a core group of people who worked for the presidency, not a specific president. And most of them that came there, well, by far and away, I did a study one time, like 93% of the staff that come to the White House in the executive residence fulfill their career there, 25, 30, 40, even 50 years. And they become quite close together. The people that we had there, the chefs, the florists, everybody, they worked to the highest of proficiency in their various areas. And they were marvelous people to work with. The staff was dedicated to their job, but more importantly, dedicated to the presidency and making the president and the first lady as comfortable as possible.
Well, the public sees the press secretary in the briefing room and the president coming and going and the political figures, but they don't see the behind the scenes, the people that make it happen. And about 90 to 100 at any given time that you're working with and managing. And I think it's wonderful that they are there, as you said, for the country and for the presidency, and are no politics involved. And oftentimes, or many times throughout history, there have been generational. Some family members have worked there. Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, quite a few. We've had butlers that have had their sons and daughters. I mean, it's like I said, it is truly a family. The ground superintendent who was there since the Kennedy administration, Irv Williams, his son was there as a plumber. Gary Williams.
The Ficklins.
The Ficklins, I was saying the butlers and their sons and everything that worked there for years. And it was a very close-knit group of people who worked together. I mean, we had a gentleman who was responsible for doing the windows, Stuart Stevens. He also cleaned all the chandeliers in the White House. Well, that's a pretty difficult, thousands of little pieces of crystal. He'd take them off individually and clean them and put them back up. But he was also responsible for cleaning the exterior windows of the White House and the interior windows. I mean, it was just a wonderful group of people that I can't say enough about them and their professionalism. They made my job so much easier.
Well, let's delve into your story. You started the White House in 1970 during the Nixon presidency. You don't start as chief usher. You began in another role and evolved to that chief usher position. Tell us how you first entered service at the White House and what that role was.
I was in the military and had, after I came back from overseas, was made aware of the fact that the White House police was being absorbed into a new entity called the Executive Protective Service, which was going to be under the direction of the Secret Service, because there'd been around the world bombings of various capitals and various entities. And the Executive Protective Service was going to expand from the old White House police to include protection of the embassies in the Washington, D.C. vicinity. I applied for the job after about 6 months of background checks and everything. I was accepted, joined a group of people, and then I went through the process, and after 3-4 months, had the opportunity to become a part of the Executive Protective Service. I was a valedictorian for that class, and the weekend before we were supposed to graduate, we were playing down on the ellipse south of the White House and playing a touch football game. And I jumped up and intercepted a pass and came down and broke my ankle.
Oh, my gosh.
So I graduated. Everybody else was in uniform, police uniform, and I'm in a suit because I had a leg cast on the whole time. But because of that, my career changed dramatically because I couldn't go out on post. I couldn't take a position out in the street. I went to an interior position, an administrative position called in the office of that was referred to as the White House Control Center. The Control Center was responsible for checking everybody who came into the White House through the gate. They had to be cleared, vetted, if you will, before they came in. We also took care of all the alarms throughout the White House, cameras and so forth. And we also tracked the personnel, the members of the Executive Protective Service. So that's where I ended up. I was supposed to be there until my injury healed. It turned out that it healed in about 2 months, but I was in that job for 4 years. So I must have done something right there.
And in that role, you obviously met the people who were working in the house, and they saw you working and doing well. And how did you evolve up from that position?
It became aware to me by one of the assistant ushers that I got to know over the phone, and Nelson Pierce, and he said that one of the assistant ushers was going to retire, and would I be interested in applying for the position? And I said, of course. I enjoyed the activity level in the executive residence, and also the amount of contact with the first family. And so I applied. Rex Scouten interviewed me, who was my forerunner, and I was in the right position. I had just finished college, going to school at night, with a business and a criminal justice degree. And at that time, the National Park Service, who had been tracking the finances of the executive residence, which has a separate budget from the Congress, he was retiring also. And they needed somebody to be able to take over the budgetary activities and tracking of the finances for the executive residence. And so I was in the right place at the right time. I was hired. And after, once again, going through pretty exhaustive background, because you have all the residence staff, some people don't realize that the Secret Service protects the president 24 hours a day. But there's a place where they come to the door, and the Secret Service is outside of that door, not letting anybody in. But the people that are behind that door, other than the family, are the resident staff. So we receive a little bit higher level of scrutiny when it comes to being vetted and checked out.
So the Nixons were the first family that you worked with and got to know. What were they like?
I had been promoted to the position of sergeant, and there'd been a time there for about 6 or 8 months where I was stationed at various posts, which the sergeants would occupy, and which put you closer to the family and the staff of the rest of the White House, and had an opportunity to deal with the family at that level, but not as personally as I did later when I got into the usher's office. But I saw them in casual walking from one place to another, discussions about various minor things. And so I didn't have as much contact with the Nixons personally. It was more in the formal circumstance that I had contact with them.
And when you began having a more direct relationship with the Fords, I would imagine, then that changes, and you are brought into awareness of what really happens upstairs, behind the scenes that nobody sees. And tell us a little bit about what is upstairs. How does the family live, and what is that like?
It's one of the primary things that the chief usher gets involved with, is trying to make sure that the living quarters, their personal quarters on the second and third floor, they need to become the family's home. And the chief usher works with the first lady, the president, whoever they designate, and to try and make sure that that atmosphere, the home atmosphere, is incorporated at the White House. The White House doesn't have a way that the president fits into things. The White House staff transforms the personal quarters to the living space and the home of the president and the first lady.
Mm-hmm. And of course, there were children, older children with the Fords, and you had a high school prom at the White House during your time there. Tell us about that.
Well, that was quite an interesting time. Susan was a wonderful person to be around, and she liked the activity level, and she would come down frequently and sit in the usher's office and talk with the ushers and with the Secret Service agents from time to time who were there. You have to think about what it was like for a teenager to go to high school and have Secret Service escort, not only to and from, but physically around at all times in that circumstance. And we've all been there. And that has to be really difficult. And then later in the Carter administration, when Amy was only 12 years, a pre-teenager, that was tough to live with, I'm sure.
Well, it was the Ford presidency that you were dealing with all kinds of family issues. There was the birthing of puppies at the White House. So it's like a real house. It's like a real home.
It is their home. During the time that they're here, whether they're there for either 4 or 8 years, it is their home, and that's what the resident staff was responsible for trying to maintain.
You mentioned the fact that people don't really know behind the scenes, but what other misconceptions do people have about the White House and living there and working there that they may not think about, but that you saw up close and personal?
We always felt that one of the objectives of the resident staff was to allow the president, first lady, and their family and their guests to come into the White House, especially the private quarters, and feel outside of the purview of the ever-watching press and the cameras that are all around them, and can be at home.
And have their own routine. If they have dinner together, then have meals together, to work on, do their homework, and the things that we would do in our families and in our homes. And even at holidays, we see the big ceremonial tree in the Blue Room, but on Christmas morning, the family doesn't go down and unwrap their presents underneath that tree. They have to have holidays unto themselves as well. And that's a part of the chief usher's role, is to give them that normalcy, help them facilitate, whether they're in the White House or Camp David or wherever they may be, help them celebrate birthdays and holidays and occasions that keep them as a family. Is there a special memory you have from one of those experiences, a holiday experience?
One of the things that we want to try and open up to the family is the ability to use the professionalism of the staff. Like you mentioned Christmas, decorating at Christmas time. We all go around and put our things up and candles and do all those things and put decorations on the tree. And the staff is there to be able to help do that and create things for the family that would make them comfortable. I think that helps with the family being able to be comfortable. They want to do all those things, but the staff can relieve some of those pressures and allow that to get done. In the Clinton administration, one of the first things I talked to Mrs. Clinton about was what she wanted to do in the family quarters for Christmas. And she said, the first thing we have to do is make sure we don't have too many greens too soon. I said, okay. She said, because Bill has a problem with pine scent.
Oh, interesting.
He had a reaction. The pine scent was something that was difficult. But she wanted a family Christmas tree. So we waited until the day before Christmas, Christmas Eve, to erect the family's Christmas tree. So it's things like that the ability of the family to be able to ask for something like that and get it taken care of. And Mrs. Clinton was a busy lady, as all first ladies are, and she didn't even have to put her decorations on the tree. She could ask the staff, you should put them out, and which ones are the special ones. So it's all those special touches that are available to the families that we want to make as I said, I keep going back to the same thing. It's a home.
Well, your first presidential transition working in the usher's office would have been from Ford to Carter. And you have to have some attachment to a family as you're working so closely and collaboratively with them. What is that like, shifting gears from one family to another and doing it so abruptly on one day, January the 20th?
Yeah. At that time, I was an assistant usher. Rex Scouten had all the pressure on him. Obviously, the Fords hadn't been there for a full term. But the Carters coming in was a change, not only in family, but in the political parties. So there's an awful lot of planning. I never really understood how much planning there was until I was responsible for doing it later. And on that inauguration day, you're saying goodbye to somebody that you literally have lived with and worked with and for a period of years. And it's not an easy time to say goodbye. And that very quickly has to be put behind, because from the time the president-elect arrives and then leaves with the sitting president to go to the Capitol until later that afternoon when the new president comes down Pennsylvania Avenue and does the review of the inaugural parade, there's a complete changeover that takes place. We close down one family's home and open up another family's home. The intent is, and was always reached, no boxes unpacked, everything, family's clothes hung where they're supposed to be, furniture changed, linens changed to their preference, snacks in the kitchen on the shelves, refrigerator stocked with their favorite products. That's all done in 4 hours.
Wow.
5 at the most. And we've had some surprises through the years when there were children and grandchildren who got a little antsy at the parade, and they were brought back inside and ended up inside after 2 hours of the parade instead of 4 or 5. But that transition is not easy for the staff and for the families. I mean, they're saying goodbye to people that they've lived with, and it's not an easy transition from the family standpoint.
Well, during the Ford presidency, they celebrated the American Bicentennial. We're coming up on America 250, the 250th anniversary. But even though President Ford did not have a full term, it was a very significant moment in our nation's history, and a significant state dinner was held with Queen Elizabeth. Tell us about that. Use that as an example of what are preparations for a state dinner like.
Planning. Lots and lots of planning. We usually get for a state dinner a couple of months notice. I mean, the initial feelers go out from the president through the State Department for a foreign head of state to come and visit the United States. And then at that point, it becomes the responsibility of the social secretary to put things in motion in conjunction with the president, the first lady's desires. And then at that point, after those decisions are made, then it comes down to the real hard work, and that's the preparation and the food and the wines and which plates are we going to use and how many people are going to be at the dinner.
And who those people are.
Who those people are. And during the bicentennial year, we had a tent up in the Rose Garden the entire summer. And we did pretty much 2 state visits a month from spring to fall. There's so much that goes on behind the scene. Luckily, and it's a term that my wife uses frequently for me. She calls me Clipboard Gary because I had planning notes with me all the time. I carried a portfolio with me, and inside of that was my calendar and my notebook, and I was always making notes, and planning was the key. Trying to make sure that everybody knew what their responsibility was, what they were going to do, and having people that had been through it before makes life immensely easier. And it's just making sure that everybody knows what they're responsible for, what they're going to do, the time frames that they have to do it.
Well, the Carter presidency. Working with President Carter, is there a favorite memory or something about him and that presidency that stands out to you?
President Carter was, my own opinion, I think was one of the most brilliant men. I mean, he had a memory. It was wonderful. He was constantly reading. He got into things meticulously, though, even to the point of, at one point late in administration, he took up fly fishing that he did at Camp David and and down, sometimes when he went down to Georgia. And he wanted to make his own flies. And he had us purchase a special gooseneck lamp that would extend over his chair that he had so that he could get down and meticulously wind these the flies. But he also, things like when he first came into office, he initiated a speed reading course for himself and the West Wing staff, because the volumes of information that were going across the desk. He invited people to use the tennis court, but he kept the record of who was going to be there.
He kept the schedule of that. And was he a president that was more into the details of the apparatus of the White House structure than others were?
I don't think that the residence, that was pretty much Mrs. Carter's bailiwick, but the president was meticulous about everything that he did. And he enjoyed the White House grounds. He and Mrs. Carter, quite frequently in the evening after dinner, would go out and walk around the South grounds and look at the trees and the bushes and the flowers. Rex Scouten and Irv Williams, the superintendent of the grounds for the Park Service, who was also supervised by the usher's office, they came up with an idea of labeling all of the trees and the plantings in the South grounds and on the North grounds with labels for the President and Mrs. Carter, so they didn't have to ask what the specific tree was or who it was planted by or what the botanical name, and we put the botanical name and the common name on the plaques and put them in front of all the trees and the plantings throughout the South grounds. And that was the responsibility of a decision made by former Chief Usher Rex Scouten and Irv Williams in behalf of just understanding the family's interest in the grounds.
Things that you see today like that you take for granted, and you don't think that it had a beginning and an interest of a president that may have caused that to happen, and then it continues. Mm-hmm. Well, it was during that presidency, of course, that the Iranian hostage crisis took place, and I heard President Carter speak to spending more time in prayer during that time than he ever had in his life, and that he would walk the grounds in contemplation, and that he would spend more time at the White House. When there are moments of national crisis or national concern, how does the chief usher and the resident staff accommodate that or work to help the president and his family deal with that from a personal perspective?
We want to respond in being helpful. The kitchen might do something special. Mrs. Carter liked soups. So, and the other presidents have too, and that would be something that they would offer, comforting food. Little things that could be, the florist may change the decorations from being more flowing and open and be more somber. It's really taken the feeling that we develop for the family's activities and trying to, without being intrusive, address those concerns. And I think all the families that I had the privilege of serving, they acknowledged that. Thank you for, understanding. They had presidents, mothers and fathers passed away while they were in service as president. And, just trying to be helpful and consoling from our standpoint of what we could do to help them get through this difficult time.
So you have to have some empathy and sensitivity to the scenario.
And when there are those kind of major overseas activities or something in the United States, but mainly overseas, the presidents have a tendency to stay close to home. They don't travel. They stay because, number one, they have the Situation Room in the West Wing. But number two, it's just being available immediately to respond to things. And it's sometimes it can't do on the road.
Well, the election of 1980, there's a transition. The President Carter loses to Ronald Reagan. And in January of 1981, the Reagans come in, and they're there for 8 years. And it's during that presidency that you become a chief usher. And there's something that I read or came to understand in the book that really surprised me for those who knew President and Mrs. Reagan and certainly knew of Mrs. Reagan's reputation. I believe you said that she was the easiest first lady that you worked with. Tell us about that.
Mrs. Reagan, unlike most of us, never had hills and valleys. She always was very temperate. She knew what she wanted. She knew what she liked. She communicated that well, and she expected it, that level. It makes it tremendously easier when you know exactly what's expected of you.
Wow.
And she was very appreciative of what the staff did, and certainly in her demeanor let everybody know that she was appreciative of this level on a constant basis, because that's the way she was. A great admirer of Mrs. Reagan.
Mm-hmm. As am I. How did you receive word that you were going to be the chief usher?
When Rex Scouten decided to retire in 86, he came to me and said, I'm going to retire, and I'm going to offer your name to the president and Mrs. Reagan as the next chief usher to succeed me. He said, I think you've shown that you the capacity to handle what's going on. And he said, I'd like you to start now. He said, because I think that they will agree. They did, and the president appointed me. Rex was a good friend. He was a mentor, and a better example I couldn't have had in the position that I had.
Ronald Reagan, was he the same person personally he loved to say, had a sense of humor, he loved people, liked to engage with people. Was he the same behind the camera as he was in front of the camera?
It's a great misconception. Everybody says, well, he was an actor. He was just acting. No. What you saw with President Reagan was what you got, 24 hours a day. I only saw him, I think, twice in 8 years when he was angry. And both times had to do with circumstances dealing with the tough negotiations at times in Capitol Hill. Later that evening, I had taken him up on the elevator, and he'd said some comments about some of the people that he was dealing with on Capitol Hill, that they hadn't played fair. And they had promised him one thing and then turned against him. And he said some things in the elevator, wasn't very happy and angry, I think is the best way to put it. And later that evening, I had to take some papers up to him that were brought over to the residence by his staff. And he actually apologized to me for him having shown anger. He was very kind. One of the big examples that I always use about President Reagan is when he was coming back from an event away from the White House by helicopter, and he was very much in conversation with one of his aides. They walked through the diplomatic reception room, made a turn, went down the hall, going back to the Oval Office. And in doing so, he passes the elevator and the police officer that's there across from the elevator that guards anybody going to the elevator from getting upstairs. And President Reagan was in conversation with his aide, and he walked down the hall, and he got out to the colonnade, and he turned around and walked back. And I'm standing there. I was wondering, does he have something he wanted to tell me? No, he walked over to a police officer, and he said, I didn't acknowledge you when I walked past, and I wanted to say thank you.
Wow.
And then he turned and walked around. And that's the way he was all the time. There was a time upstairs in the residence, the president got mad at Mrs. Reagan's dog, Rex.
Oh, yes.
She named after Rex Scouten. And Rex would go down the hall from time to time, the center hall, and look in the Lincoln bedroom and bark for no reason. There wasn't anybody there or anything. And of course, the Lincoln bedroom, some people had said that's where the ghost of Lincoln is. And the president would get upset with Rex, and he'd walk down the hall, and he said, Rex, come back here. But then he'd calm down, and what you saw was what you got, whether it was on the camera or not.
There was the day of the assassination attempt against President Reagan, and a jarring moment for our nation, and I'm sure an adjustment in the White House staff. Fortunately, that is a very rare occurrence. What happens in a scenario like that? How do you, with the First Lady and the president's now away at the hospital, and you're dealing with trying to keep some normalcy, but it's a tragic scenario?
In the circumstance with President Reagan, of course, it's marvelous that the Secret Service agent made the decision immediately to go to the hospital. And that probably saved the president's life. I was at home at the time, as it turned out. It was my day off. And I called in from home, because I'd been watching it on television, and asked the assistant usher who was on duty if I should come in. And he said, no, stay put, because we don't know what's going to happen. Wait till you hear from Rex. The president, after 2 or 3 days after the operation, wasn't very comfortable with the food at the hospital. it just didn't settle in his stomach properly, or Mrs. Reagan was very concerned about Ronnie and making sure that things were right. And she asked if the White House staff, the residence kitchen, could provide meals to the president.
That's very
and
nice.
would we take it over? So because she wanted Ronnie to have the White House cooking. And sure enough, President started eating again. And then when he came home, he ended up recuperating. The resident staff, of course, tremendously solicitous, even more so in that circumstance, even to the point where we had heard from the president's medical team that the president could possibly be subject to a problem if he gets stung by a bee. And the president, after recuperating for a few days in the solarium inside, said, I'd really like to go out and get some fresh air outside. And we got a chair from the Truman balcony and brought it up, favorite chair that he had, and put it out underneath the eaves on the promenade around the third floor where the president could get outside. One of the butlers was called to bring a glass of iced tea to the president. And as he did so, he looked up and saw a bee flying around, or a wasp, a hornet, one of those things, around in the area of the president. And he came back in, immediately called and told the assistant marshal on duty that, if there's a problem with bees, we ought to be aware of it. And so we called right away and as soon as the president went inside, had the operating engineers who are trained in pest control go up and take care of the potential nest that was being considered.
Wow.
It's things like that to, be it,
right.
Here's the butler, it was being attentive to the fact that the president might be in some discomfort if that occurred, and just making that warning, and then it was taken care of.
Did you become good friends with the Jelly Belly people during those years?
We sure did. In fact, day after inauguration, I guess it was, the president had a meeting in the cabinet room in the West Wing adjacent to the Oval Office. And we got a call a couple hours before that meeting was to take place, and one of his aides asked if we had a jar that we could provide. And we said, what kind of jar? He said, well, the president has a habit of filling a jar with Jelly Bellies. We didn't know what Jelly Bellies were. and then passed it around the room for everybody to take a couple of Jelly Bellies. And that started a conversation and kind of broke the ice and the tension that was in the room. And that's the way the president started all of his meetings. We actually just took some petty cash and went over to the local store and bought it was a jar that people could put their hand in, and we sent it over to the Oval Office, and that stayed there for 8 years.
All the time. That's great.
And eventually there were little boxes of
yes.
Jelly Bellies
Right.
with the presidential seal on them that were
right.
passed out to guests to the Oval Office. So at that time they were only in the West, in California,
Yes.
and now they're across the country.
Yes. And now a staple at the Reagan Library gift shop as well. You can still get them. So after the 8 years of the Reagan presidency, there's an election, and the vice president is elected president. And George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush come in. Familiar faces, but in a different way. You would have seen them and interacted with them. Now they're moving into the House. Your thoughts and memories of that presidency?
Of course, we were aware, and the president, vice president and Mrs. Bush were aware of the resident staff because they had been there for 8 years. On and off, obviously they weren't living there, but they'd been there. But they'd principally been in the public rooms, the ground and first floor of the residence, not as many times in the private quarters. And I found it unusual that Mrs. Reagan didn't invite Mrs. Bush down after the election to view the private quarters.
Which is a customary thing to do.
That first ladies usually do. And when I just went and asked Mrs. Reagan, I said, are you going to invite? And Mrs. Reagan, very uncustomarily, said, oh, she's been here for 8 years on and off. She knows what it's all like. And that was the end of the conversation. So I called Susan Porter Rose, who was Barbara Bush's assistant. And I said, I'm sure that Mrs. Bush would like to, and I said, I can meet privately with her. Nobody needs to know about it. And so I ended up taking books and Historical Association books and other books that I had put together briefing books, to the vice president's residence and had a meeting with Mrs. Bush. And because she was very concerned that the house was being changed over for a family for two who had occasional guests to a house
cast of thousands
that was going to be on inaugural night. I think it was 23 house guests. And could we accommodate, or should they make arrangements to have people stay over at Blair House? And I assured her that we would make those accommodations. We had enough beds. We bring them in. In fact, she said, oh, the grandchildren, they can sleep on sleeping beds or on the couches. And I said, well, I think, Mrs. Bush, we can. And she was just very acceptable to that and very pleased to know that the house could be changed over in that manner. They were wonderful to deal with. Mrs. Bush had one of the quickest wits of anybody I've ever known. And we had wonderful contacts personally. Mrs. Bush, even to the point of adopting my daughter one time, the Easter egg roll took place. And Mrs. Bush normally went out, and with her interest in reading,
sure,
she usually had a tent or a stage that was set up, and she'd go and she'd read a book to children on the South grounds. And this day I decided to get my daughter and come with me, and she did. And I was standing at the South portico with my daughter as Mrs. Bush came down to go out. And she looked at me and she looked at my daughter. She told my daughter, she said, Claire, I don't have any grandchildren with me today, so you come with me. And there they go. They go off. Mrs. Bush takes my daughter's hand and off they go. My initial parental responsibility said, well, I should probably go along. Then I thought, she's safer with her than she is with me.
She's in good hands.
So I decided I can stay back here.
Well, at the end of the Clinton presidency, another Bush is elected, and here they come again. And a unique moment in history when you have a father and a son who have been presidents, and there's Inauguration Day, and George W. Bush goes into that Oval Office for the first time, and you're witness to a little moment of family history and American history there.
Of course, one of the first things that we always do when a new president's coming into office is have them change the Oval Office to some of their desire, to make a complete split from the previous president. They change out the desks, change out the furniture in the room, paintings on the walls, statues, whatever else they want to do to make those changes. On inaugural day after the parade, and everybody come in from the reviewing stand, and they were tired and getting ready to go to the inaugural walls and everything. I got a call directly from President's Oval Office. This was President George W. Bush. And he asked me, he said, Gary, where's the old man? I said, well, Mr. President, the former president, I think, is up in his room relaxing. And he said, well, could you ask him to come over to the Oval Office? I said, yes, sir. I called the bedroom. They were staying in the Queen's bedroom, and Mrs. Bush answered. Barbara Bush answered the phone. And I told her the president was asking for his father if he would like. And she said, well, he'll be down in a couple of minutes. So I called the president's office back and told him, your father will be over in a couple of minutes. Kind of interesting, the father, the former president,
yes.
41, 43.
Yes, you say Mr. President and everybody turns.
And so I went down by the elevators. I usually do when the president comes down from upstairs, and I'm waiting there. And I met the former president, and we walked down the colonnade talking about times that we'd done that when he was the president. And we walked into the Oval Office, and the now president is standing behind the desk in the Oval Office that he'd chosen to be in there. And he looked at his father and he said, is this your chair? And the former president looked at it and he said, I believe it is. And he looked at me and said, is it? I said, yes, sir, that's your chair, and we thought it would be appropriate for your son to have that chair. And that was quite emotional, I have to admit. But I felt at that point I needed to get out of there and let them talk. So I did, and about half an hour later, they came back to the residence and laughing and arms around each other, and father-son meeting, and had a great time.
Well, Laura Bush is First Lady. Her mother-in-law had been First Lady. How did she distinguish herself from her mother-in-law in that role?
It was easy. She had her own way of doing things. She liked flowers in a certain way. But there were some things that Barbara Bush did that she and the president restored. They used to have what they called movie nights, the former president, where they'd invite friends and family and Congress. And that was one of the first things the new president, George W. and Laura Bush, reinstated, because they invited the Congress, press, General Washington people. But basically, it was not a problem addressing the difference between the two, because they were each strong women, and they knew what they wanted, and we were there to accommodate that.
September 11th, 2001. Tell us about that day.
Obviously, the most frightening day of my service at the White House. In the morning, the president was down in Florida. He'd flown down the previous day, and he was going to be talking about education, because that was the priority that he had established for his presidency in the first term. And Mrs. Laura Bush was going down to the Congress before Ted Kennedy's Committee on Childhood Education. And I can't remember, it was like about 8 o'clock or thereabouts. I was at the elevator where I usually am when the president and first lady are coming and going, in case she had information that she wanted to give me or anything. And I walked with her. We were talking about Christmas. And as she got in, a beautiful day. We talked about how wonderful the day it was.
Yeah, it was a glorious weather
absolutely
day.
The temperature was wonderful. It was a bright blue sky. And as she was getting into the car, her agent held the door open, and he said to her quietly, "There's been a terrible accident in New York. A plane has flown into a World Trade Center building." And he pulled back and he said to me, "I understand from our office," the Secret Service had an office just inside the diplomatic reception room, just a small cubbyhole really, but they had a television in there where they could watch. And he said, "It's on television in our office." So I stood there for a couple of minutes and waited while the car drove out of the South grounds, and I was sure that it wasn't coming back to the South portico. And it drove out. And so I turned, looked at what was going on, because that night we were having the congressional picnic. And there were going to be about 1,300 people on the South grounds. The entire Congress, the majority of their senior staff, the president's cabinet, and it was being catered by an outfit from down in Texas that had brought in large mobile-size trailers that had cooking apparatus. And
yes, those of us in the neighborhood smell that cooking a couple of days beforehand, and it's very enticing.
Yeah. And they had been there all night cooking. And there were tents up and picnic tables that the Park Service had been setting up over 2 days, and a stage. So it was 10 minutes or so before I went back inside to the diplomatic reception room and went to go into the Secret Service office to see if they had any more information. Well, the room was packed. I walked around, went by the elevator, walked up the one flight of steps into my office, the usher's office on the first floor, and I went to walk in, and my office was packed, and people were all looking at the television. And as I stepped through the door, I saw a plane fly into a building. And I looked at one of my assistants and I said, "Oh my goodness, how'd they get that on television like that?" He said, "That's the second plane." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, that's the second plane that has crashed." And they are major planes. They're not small aircraft. And my heart sank. I got sick to my stomach, literally, and I immediately picked up the phone and called social office, Kathy Fenton. I said, "Kathy, you obviously are aware, I assume, of this incident in New York. We got to cancel this picnic. I mean, it's not going to go forward." And she said, "Well, I have to wait and get word from the West Wing." I said, "Well, I can't wait. I need to stop people from doing what they're doing and clear the grounds." I decided to go back outside and make sure that people were starting to get things clear. And as I walked out the diplomatic reception room doors, I heard a loud thud, and I looked out across the top of the trees down towards the Pentagon, and I saw a big cloud, black. And the police officer that was standing there at the door I said, oh my God. He said, yeah, a plane just crashed into the Pentagon. At one point, I found myself standing on the South grounds when we heard about the other plane that was in the air still. The White House was evacuated. I kept 4 or 5 guys with me.
But when the White House was evacuated, thinking a plane might be coming that direction, you stayed.
I thought we had to stay because the whole grounds where the helicopter normally lands was filled with over 120 picnic tables, each weighed about 350 pounds, normally placed by a mechanical system. And I knew enough about President Bush. He was going to come back to the White House because the alternate landing site for the president is the Pentagon. Well, that wasn't going to happen. So I knew he was coming back to the White House. So I wanted to keep a core group of people with me so that we could clear those picnic tables. To this day, if you see the replays on 9/11, they show the president getting off the helicopter in the South grounds and walking to the Oval Office, and there are stacks of picnic tables along the roadway. But it was a frightening day. We stayed there. We did what we had to do.
So how did you come to the point where you knew it was your time to end your service?
Towards the end of the second Bush administration, when there were 2 years left. I've always said that you'll know when it's time to retire. And I decided that my time had come. I made my notice to Mrs. Bush and to the president that I was going to retire. And the reason I was doing that was because of family conditions. My father and mother were getting older. My wife's parents were older. And so we had some obligations with them. But mainly because I didn't feel that I could go through another transition because it's all encompassing. From the day the election happens until middle of February, it is so intense for the chief usher with all the planning and everything that there's no way that I wanted to go through another transition. But I wanted to give somebody who was going to replace me 2 years to get in place.
Before you left, President Bush gave you a significant honor.
Yes, he did. Quite unexpected. A civilian award for service to the government. I was taken aback by it. They did it at a reception that they had for me. The President and Mrs. Bush were most gracious. And I was taken aback by the whole activity. And the number of people that came surprised me.
Well, Gary, I came to Washington during the Reagan presidency, and you were an icon to me then. And I thought, I don't know if I'll ever get to meet Gary Walters. And then to have the privilege of working with you and hearing your story. As I started this conversation, I said, you are White House history. Thank you for what you've given to the White House, to the presidency, to our organization, and for sharing your memories in this extraordinary book. And I appreciate you, respect you, and value all that you've done for our country. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you all for listening and watching today. Be sure to subscribe to the White House 1600 Sessions on your favorite podcast provider so that you never miss an episode, and watch the video version on YouTube and Facebook. Your support of the White House Historical Association makes this work possible. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book, or even the official White House Christmas ornament, you're helping to fund our education mission through teacher programming, publishing, our White House History Live, in-person and virtual events, and our latest initiative, the People's House, a White House experience. You know, we're bringing the White House and its storied history to life at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue, and it's open to everyone. So plan your visit today and register for free passes at our website, thepeopleshouse.org. And you can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.